Closing arguments are underway in the Derek Chauvin trial. He's the former Minneapolis police officer charged in the death of George Floyd. CBS 2's Hazel Sanchez is in the newsroom live for us at noon with more. Hazel?
Yeah, Chris, after more than 13 days of sometimes tense and emotional testimony, the jurors are now hearing closing arguments. The prosecution wrapping up its closing argument this morning, saying former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knew better, but didn't do better.
After 3 weeks and 45 witnesses, the jury began hearing closing arguments in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the state with the burden of proving without a reasonable doubt that the former Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd when he restrained him on the ground by kneeling on his neck in May of 2020.
This was not an accident. He did not trip and fall and find himself upon George Floyd's knee and neck. He did what he did on purpose. And it killed George Floyd. That force for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that killed George Floyd. He betrayed the badge and everything it stood for.
Last week, Chauvin pleaded the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, saying he would not testify in his own defense. Today, prosecutors laid out in painful detail Floyd's final moments in his life, desperately crying out for help.
George Floyd's final words on May 25, 2020 were, "Please, I can't breathe." And he said those words to Mr. Officer. He said those words to the defendant. He asked for help with his very last breath. But Mr. Officer did not help. The defendant did not help. He stayed on top of him, continued to push him down, to grind his knees, to twist his hand, to twist his fingers into the handcuffs. But George Floyd was not a threat to anyone. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He wasn't trying to do anything to anyone. All that was required was a little compassion. And none was shown on that day.
After the defense gives its closing argument, the prosecution will give a rebuttal argument. The jury will then begin deliberating and will be sequestered for the duration of the deliberation. If found guilty, Derek Chauvin faces up to 40 years in prison. In the newsroom, Hazel Sanchez, CBS 2 News.
Hazel, thank you, and we ask you to stay with CBS 2 for continuing coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. For a look back to testimony and real-time updates, you can go to cbsnewyork.com. In other